Lakeith Stanfield's journey does not begin with privilege, guidance, or certainty. It begins with instability, confusion, and survival, because he was born into a world that offered very little structure and even less reassurance growing up. In San Bernardino, California, moving through foster homes, shelters, and temporary spaces where nothing felt permanent except uncertainty. And when your childhood is built on shifting ground, you either lose yourself trying to belong or you build an identity so strong that no environment can erase it. And Lakeith chose the harder path, the one that demanded self-awareness far beyond his years, learning early that silence could be dangerous and expression could be salvation, discovering poetry, music, and introspection as tools to process chaos, pain, and questions that had no easy answers. Because when no one teaches you who you are, you must figure it out alone, and that loneliness became both his burden and his fuel, shaping a mind that observed more than it spoke, felt more than it showed, and questioned everything around it. And while others chased approval, Lakeith chased truth, enrolling in drama not because he dreamed of fame, but because acting allowed him to explore identity without explanation, to exist without labels, to speak emotions he didn't yet have words for. And when he landed his breakout role in Short-Term 12, it was not luck. It was recognition of something raw and undeniable, a presence that felt lived in rather than performed, fragile yet fearless, quiet yet powerful. And suddenly the industry noticed a man who didn't fit traditional molds, didn't speak in rehearsed confidence, didn't chase spotlight energy, but instead brought depth, vulnerability, and unpredictability to every frame. And what made Lakeith Stanfield different was not just talent, it was courage. The courage to be strange in a world that demands familiarity, the courage to be honest in an industry built on illusion, and the courage to stay uncomfortable rather than fake confidence. Because he never tried to be the loudest in the room, he became the most memorable by being the most authentic, choosing roles that challenged audiences rather than comforted them, portraying characters who were broken, conflicted, intelligent, lost, observant, and deeply human, reflecting parts of society people often ignore or misunderstand. And even as his career grew with films like Get Out, Sorry to Bother You, and Judas and the Black Messiah, Lakeith never presented himself as a finished product, openly acknowledging confusion, mental struggles, identity questions, and the pressure of navigating success without a traditional foundation. Because when you come from nothing, success can feel as overwhelming as failure. And what makes his story inspiring is not that he conquered fear, but that he learned to walk with it, using vulnerability as strength rather than weakness, refusing to polish himself into something easier to consume, and instead becoming a symbol for anyone who has ever felt different, misunderstood, or out of place, because Lakeith Stanfield's existence itself challenges the idea that you must fit in to succeed, proving that sometimes the very thing that makes you feel isolated is the same thing that makes you irreplaceable. And this is only the beginning of his story, because his rise is not about arrival, it is about evolution, about learning how to survive visibility without losing yourself, and about turning a fractured beginning into a future defined by intention, courage, and creative freedom. As Lakeith Stanfield stepped further into the industry, recognition arrived faster than clarity, and this sudden visibility forced him to confront a reality most people never see from the outside, that success does not automatically bring peace, especially when your foundation was built on instability, because fame magnifies everything you haven't healed. And Lakeith was never someone who hid from that truth, openly expressing discomfort with attention, confusion about identity, and the emotional whiplash of being praised by strangers while still feeling disconnected internally. And instead of pretending confidence, he leaned into honesty, a decision that confused many but liberated him creatively. Because when you stop performing strength, you create space for real growth. And this approach shaped the kinds of roles he chose. Characters that existed on the margins, observers rather than leaders, thinkers rather than talkers, men caught between worlds, reflecting his own internal landscape. And while Hollywood often pressures actors to chase stability through predictable roles, Lakeith repeatedly chose uncertainty, selecting projects that risked misunderstanding but offered truth. because he understood something most people don't realize until much later in life. Fulfillment rarely lives in safety, and as his performances grew more layered and intense, so did public scrutiny, with interviews dissected, words misinterpreted, moments taken out of context, and instead of retreating, Lakeith responded with vulnerability, acknowledging mental health struggles, spiritual searching, and the complexity of navigating fame without a clear roadmap, reminding people that growth is rarely linear and that confusion is not a failure. It is a stage of becoming. And what makes Lakeith Stanfield's journey powerful is his refusal to let other people define his narrative, even when it would have been easier to stay silent. Because silence for him was never neutral. It was something he had survived before, and this time he chose to speak, to express, to create, even when misunderstood. And through this he became more than an actor. He became a mirror for those who feel unseen, a voice for those who don't fit clean categories, and a reminder that being different is not something to overcome, it is something to understand and protect. Because authenticity requires bravery in a world that rewards conformity, and Lakeith's continued rise is not driven by validation, but by a quiet commitment to self-discovery, to art that asks questions rather than answers them, and to a life that values truth over comfort, proving that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remain yourself while the world tries to turn you into something simpler. As Lakeith Stanfield continued evolving, something within him began to settle, not into certainty, but into acceptance, an understanding that he did not need to fully explain himself to be valid, and this realization marked a turning point in both his art and his life, because when you stop seeking approval, your work gains depth, intention, and freedom. And Lakeith's performances began to carry a quiet confidence, a presence that didn't demand attention but commanded it through stillness, subtlety, and emotional truth. And while many actors measure success by visibility, he measured it by alignment, choosing roles that resonated with his inner questions rather than his public image, allowing himself to grow in real time rather than present a polished illusion. And this authenticity resonated deeply with audiences who recognized themselves in his contradictions, his vulnerability, and his refusal to simplify complex emotions. And what made Lakeith Stanfield's journey increasingly powerful was his willingness to exist in the gray areas of life, the spaces between certainty and doubt, strength and fragility, ambition and fear, because he understood that humanity does not live in extremes, it lives in nuance. And this understanding allowed him to portray characters that felt lived rather than performed, men shaped by circumstance, history, and internal conflict, reflecting the reality of many who navigate life without clear direction but with deep awareness. And as his influence grew, so did his responsibility, not as a symbol of perfection, but as proof that imperfection can be powerful, that self-exploration is not weakness, and that creativity thrives when you allow yourself to be honest, even when honesty makes others uncomfortable. And through interviews, music, and performances, Lakeith continued to challenge the idea that success must look a certain way, reminding people that healing is not linear, that growth can be messy, and that identity is something you discover repeatedly rather than once. And this message resonated especially with those who felt lost in transitional phases of life, unsure of who they were becoming, but certain they did not want to be inauthentic. And Lakeith's journey quietly affirmed that it is okay to not have all the answers, as long as you remain open, reflective, and willing to evolve. Because the courage to sit with uncertainty is often the birthplace of originality, and as he continues forward, Lakeith Stanfield stands as a reminder that you don't have to be loud to be powerful. You don't have to be understood by everyone to be meaningful, and you don't have to conform to be successful. Because sometimes the most inspiring stories are written by those who choose to stay true to themselves, while the world pressures them to become something else. As Lakeith Stanfield moved further into his journey, his life began to reflect a rare kind of courage, the courage to remain open in a world that rewards emotional armor, because instead of hardening himself against criticism, misunderstanding, or pressure, he allowed those experiences to refine him, shaping a perspective rooted in awareness rather than defense. and this internal shift changed how he approached both art and life, becoming less concerned with proving his worth and more focused on protecting his authenticity, a decision that many people struggle to make even after decades of living. And while fame continued to expand his reach, Lakeith never let it erase his sense of self, often speaking about the importance of solitude, introspection,